Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into a profound and essential conversation about the path to liberation for people of African descent worldwide. Our debate centers on a critical question. What constitutes the true foundation for freedom? Is it the ancient philosophical system of Ma'at, rooted in the great civilizations of Kemet, Nubia, and Kush? Or is it the enduring tradition of global African resistance, forged through centuries of struggle and survival? This is Ancient Ma'at versus Global African Resistance. Two compelling visions, one urgent mission. Let's begin.
Welcome to the debate. Our source material today provides a sweeping, a really necessary assertion of identity, that people of Black African ancestry are defined not solely by the horrors they survived, but, well, fundamentally by divine creation, ancient origins, and foundational achievements. The text explicitly links this identity to the great civilizations of antiquity, Tasseti, Kemet, Nubia, and Kush, detailing their contributions to science, ethics, and governance long before the historical disruptions occurred.
It really is a profound recalibration. The source, it demands we recognize that our ancestors were the builders of the world's first systems of knowledge. I mean, the implications of that truth are just enormous for understanding our collective psychological and political state today.
Exactly. But this powerful declaration of origin leads us immediately to a critical, actionable path forward. The material presents a dual imperative for liberation. It calls for reclaiming specific ancient African philosophical and spiritual systems, most notably Ma'at, and it calls for mobilizing the global African family through organized resistance against ongoing oppression. So, our central disagreement today is about the essential foundation. Which element? The specific ancient philosophical framework, like Ma'at, or the continuing history of global diasporic resistance and cultural synthesis, constitutes the definitive bedrock for liberation and for finishing the freedom work described in the text.
This really is the crux of the roadmap, isn't it?
I assert that the necessary path forward demands an explicit, systematic return to and reconstruction of those ancient African ethical and spiritual foundations. I believe this centering on the original African source is the only definitive, deep-seated counter to what the text diagnoses as the pervasive rape of the mind.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely respect the ancient origins as a starting point, I'm going to argue that the definitive foundation for the future is actually found in the enduring, synthesized, and globally organized resistance tradition. This tradition, forged in the fire of global oppression, is carried by the global African family, which proved its intellectual and cultural capacity by surviving and really fundamentally transforming itself across centuries of brutality.
Will, my position relies on understanding the sheer depth of the oppressor's initial attack. The source material establishes that the entire process of enslavement and colonization was engineered as a de-enculturation from the divine creator's original intent. It was a deliberate destruction of communal ethics like Ma'at, that core African concept of cosmic balance, truth, justice, and reciprocity. So if the wound is foundational, stemming from a war waged on African spiritual and civilizational systems, then the antidote must be equally foundational and equally explicit in its restoration.
That's a compelling argument regarding the spiritual depth of the injury. I agree. But the question is about the foundation for the future.
Right. And the text clearly links the psychological damage, the enslaver's mindset, to the internalization of foreign standards, where people measure success or beauty or intelligence by European metrics. This isn't just a social problem. It's a foundational spiritual and psychological pathology. Therefore, the only way to genuinely and permanently rectify this damage is an explicit return to the specific source, utilizing the specific systems of Kemet, the wisdom of the Imhotep lineage, and the advanced sciences that were original to us. This ensures that the new definition of self is rooted in what the ancestors built, their independent, divinely guided creations, not merely what they were forced to resist or transform under duress.
I acknowledge the absolute necessity of rectifying that psychological damage, but I believe the material provides strong evidence for a more immediate and globally applicable primary foundation. The source powerfully demonstrates that African people carried their identity in coded language, in ritual, memory, and culture, even when they were forcibly displaced. That act of survival and continuity, the creation of a global, cohesive identity through shared suffering and action, is itself the most robust foundation for the future.
That demonstrates incredible resilience, certainly. But is resilience in the face of chaos? Is that a sufficient philosophical and ethical foundation upon which to build new, universal systems of governance and law?
I believe it is the most robust foundation precisely because it has been tested globally. I mean, look at the survival mechanisms cited, revolutions like Haiti, the sustained maroon communities like Palmares, and the intellectual uprisings led by figures like Nat Turner and David Walker. They all demonstrate that African identity is a living, continuous, and highly adaptable phenomenon. The lineage of freedom fighters the text invokes, Mandela, King, Malcolm, Hampton, it represents a powerful, continuous resistance tradition. This tradition, born from synthesis and global connection, is defined not solely by a specific spiritual return, but by persistent revolutionary political organization and action in the face of Jim Crow, mass incarceration, apartheid, and ongoing state violence. The global African family's very existence is the proof that its political will and organized resistance outlasted oppression, making this enduring, synthesized movement the most practical and proven foundation for the future.
Okay, let's turn to the nature of the oppressor's attack itself, which brings us to our first core contention, the required counteraction. You center your foundation on the resistance tradition, but I believe that risks minimizing the specific intellectual and spiritual theft described in the material. The source clearly states the attack was designed to rape the mind through forced conversion, the systematic banning of African languages, the rewriting of history, and teaching doctrines of Black inferiority, all of it resulting in collective amnesia. The injury was epistemic.
I agree completely that the ideological component, the epistemic damage, was devastating and pervasive. No one can test the intellectual robbery.
Then we have to agree that the only systematic way to fully rebuild is by reclaiming the specific conceptual tools and documented achievements, the original advanced medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and ethics of civilizations like Kemet and Tassiti. I mean, their accomplishments were specifically stolen, renamed, or hidden. When the material names Mautep, it is not just offering historical trivia, it is providing a specific high standard of intellectual output that must be centered today to definitively counter the ideological lie of Black intellectual inferiority. The recovery has to be epistemic and rooted in that original knowledge base to ensure we are building from an independent, unchallenged source of truth.
I appreciate the necessity of intellectual and spiritual reconstruction. But I'm sorry, I don't buy that as the primary counteraction required today. Let me tell you why. While the mind rape created the ideological justification, the source material explicitly frames the overall historical disruption as fundamentally about controlling labor, land, and reproduction through racial capitalism. It names the responsible parties, monarchs, merchants, colonial governors, and empires, the classes and systems of power that organized global extraction for profit.
But the profits were enabled by the lie of inferiority.
Yes, but the physical reality of the oppression was the control of life itself. The source specifies that these powers used law and violence, including systematic sexual violence against mothers and daughters, to control kinship and reproduction. The attack was fundamentally material, aimed at controlling wealth and resources. Therefore, the essential counteraction has to be organized, pan-African political and economic unity to challenge that exploitation and state violence. This necessary organization is what provides material liberation, regardless of whether every individual adheres strictly to the precise tenets of Ma'at or speaks a specific ancient language, which was, as we know, brutally forced into variation during enslavement.
You speak of organization as the foundation, but organization without a common, universally accepted ethical framework. Doesn't that risk mirroring the exploitative structures you wish to dismantle? I mean, how does mere political unity ensure justice?
Because the ethical framework is synthesized in the resistance, The source material highlights that the movements themselves, from the civil rights struggle to decolonization efforts, demanded justice, equality, and self-determination, using tools and legal arguments synthesized across the diaspora. The unity built on shared purpose and revolutionary action is inclusive of all the variations of African spiritual practice today, be it Islam, Christianity, or indigenous practices, which all carry fragments of that original ethical core. The synthesis proves the adaptability and continuous survival of African ethics, in a way that a specific Kemet-centered return might unintentionally exclude portions of the global family.
That's an interesting point. Regarding inclusion, though, I would frame it differently when we look at the future roadmap outlined in the text, which is our second contention. My focus is on the stated order of operations. The text asks, where do we go from here? And it answers with what I see as a clear priority. We go back to the source, reconnecting with African history, spirituality, ethics like Ma'at. This is presented as the primary foundation upon which new institutions must be built.
But is that a chronological foundation or a conceptual one?
It is conceptual, which precedes the material action. Look, the source dedicates significant attention to critiquing the oppressor's God, which it defines as power, profit, and whiteness itself. This suggests a critical need for an ethical and spiritual reset that only the original, non-exploitative African ethical systems can provide. You cannot simply organize politically against racial capitalism if the organizing body has not first purged the spiritual deficit caused by the internalization of the enslaver's idolatry of power and profit. We have to define justice by Ma'at before we can effectively organize for it.
I see that emphasis on the source, I do, but the conclusion of the roadmap emphasizes the practicalities of organization. The final call is to organize across Africa and the diaspora to reclaim education, protect our story from erasure, practice Pan-African unity, and raise a generation that knows we are the first people, a global African nation. This is a massive, unified organizational effort, explicitly aimed at fighting contemporary existential threats.
And what drives that unity?
Shared purpose and political commitment. The unity relies more on a shared revolutionary consciousness forged through centuries of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle than on specific adherence to ancient rituals. We need to be able to immediately address things like the contemporary attacks on education and voting rights. The source mentions fighting specific political dangers similar to Project 2025 type legislative efforts. These are urgent, modern political battles. So the practical foundation must be one of unified, immediate political mobilization against verifiable threats, utilizing the successful organizational strategies developed in the diaspora.
I'm not convinced by the practicality of a restoration that's diluted by political urgency. If we do not restore the ethical core first, our political victories risk being hollow. The ethical philosophy of Ma'at isn't just balance. It's a systemic principle of justice that underlies law, governance, cosmic order. It provides a non-exploitative, community-centric model that fundamentally opposes the individualism and greed inherent in racial capitalism. If we fail to establish this as the foundation for the new African global nation, we will simply adopt Western organizational methodologies with a blackface.
But the organizational methodologies created in the diaspora are already ethically sophisticated. I mean, think of the principles driving liberation theology, or the focus on collective economics in maroon societies. These are new ethical syntheses born from the fire. To insist on a complete specific return risks sidelining the rich, diverse ethical frameworks developed by people who had to invent new ways to be free under impossible circumstances. The political will and the organizational structure are the evidence that the ethical principles survived and adapted.
Let's move to our final contention, defining the African identity through history versus civilization.
Agreed.
The initial identity statement stresses the link to the first humans and the foundational civilizations who not only existed but taught the world science, mathematics, and ethics. This places the emphasis squarely on the unparalleled innovative creators who laid the foundation of civilization itself. So to define ourselves by this foundational creation, means prioritizing the continuation of that specific high-level civilizational knowledge. We must define ourselves by our status as builders and thinkers before the disruption, using that period as the blueprint for self-determination.
I find that definition incomplete. If the material intends to mobilize a global African nation, then the identity has to be defined by the whole timeline, not just the beginning. The identity stated in the text is equally defined by the ability to survive and transform the historical disruptions. The material explicitly lists the survival through the transatlantic and other slave trades, colonization, apartheid, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration.
That's survival, which we both agree is vital. But is survival and identity foundation?
Violence. The identity, therefore, is equally defined by the resilience and intellectual creativity of the people who navigated and dismantled these systems, utilizing new frameworks of resistance, synthesis, and organization. The successful movement cited, from Dessalines in Haiti to Malcolm X in America, utilized intellectual and political legacies born directly in the diaspora. That legacy of surviving terror and creating novelty is just as fundamental to the global African nation's identity as the lineage of Imhotep. We are defined by the continuity of our struggle and the complex, beautiful cultural solutions we created in response to the historical catastrophe.
While I recognize the complexity of the diaspora's creation, I maintain that the beginning defines the standard of righteousness and balance that the subsequent actions must strive to return to. The Kemet lineage, that original philosophical depth, provides the eternal, independent standard for what we are fighting for. Without that standard, the political resistance becomes merely reactive, a fight against rather than a construction toward. We need the original architectural plans.
And the resistance tradition proves that the standard of justice and self-determination was never lost, even when the original language or specific ritual was temporarily stripped away. The political will to be free, refined through generations of struggle, is the engine. The organizational capacity developed through that resistance is the necessary vehicle. You can't drive a spiritual engine without a durable modern frame.
To summarize my position then, the central argument of the material is that oppression was designed to strip away the divine original intent and ethical systems rooted in Africa, resulting in internalized self-hatred and collective amnesia. Complete liberation, therefore, requires deliberately reversing that specific foundational process by making an explicit return to and centering the philosophical and spiritual foundations of the ancient African civilizations like Ma'at. That restoration is the only way to truly secure the mind and spirit, the essential foundation, before building the political future.
And my summary is that the identity of the global African family is defined by its continuous, enduring existence and revolutionary tradition, the evidence of survival through the worst forms of violence and exploitation. The most robust and immediately practical path forward is the organized Pan-African unity of this global family, utilizing the immense wealth of knowledge and resistance created across centuries in the diaspora and on the continent. This organizational structure, built on synthesized resilience and political action, is the necessary vehicle and the most proven foundation for the freedom work today.
The material provides a powerful and specific roadmap, forcing us to grapple with the profound tension between reclaiming deep, specific ancestral roots and mobilizing the powerful, diverse legacy of global resistance in order to finish the freedom work. Both are necessary, but the source demands we prioritize the foundation.
Indeed. The path forward requires honoring both the genesis and the continuous journey of transformation. It leaves the listener with the challenging task of determining whether our spiritual architecture must precede our political engineering, or if the engineering itself secures the spirit. Thank you for this challenging discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this profound exploration of Africa's foundational freedoms. Today's debate examined two essential perspectives on the path to liberation. On one side, we explored the necessity of returning to ancient African philosophical systems like Ma'at, reclaiming the original ethical and spiritual foundations that were systematically stripped away through enslavement and colonization. On the other side, we considered the power of the global African resistance tradition, forged through centuries of survival, adaptation, and revolutionary action across the diaspora. Both perspectives offer crucial insights. The call to restore ancient wisdom reminds us that African civilizations were the architects of humanity's first systems of knowledge, ethics, and governance. Meanwhile, the emphasis on organized resistance highlights the remarkable resilience and creativity of African people who transformed suffering into powerful movements for justice and self-determination. The question remains, which foundation should we prioritize as we continue the freedom work? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one over the other, but in understanding how both the ancient roots and the diasporic journey together define who we are and where we must go. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this critical debate. Which perspective resonates most with you? How do you see these two paths working together? Please share your insights in the comments below. And if you found this discussion valuable, subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking conversations on African history, identity, and liberation. Until next time, continue the work of freedom.